Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show, folks. It's good to have you with us. This week's show is titled We Must Outlaw Racial Preferences in the United States Armed Forces. Friends, we are going back to the Supreme Court with the fight against racism and in support of national security. The case is Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina to end their use of racial preferences in admissions, which in my opinion is clear racism. In cases like this previously, and in this case, a group representing high-ranking national security officials has filed Amici briefs supporting these racial preferences, and the court has agreed with them. How do they do it? Well, without rigorous supporting evidence, they've convinced the court these racist policies are necessary and being critical to the armed forces' ability to defend our nation's security, according to their briefs. Surprisingly, no other veterans groups have challenged these assertions until now. I'm proud to say I'm a member of Veterans for Fairness and Merit, or VFM, the group challenging this assertion, and to tell the court the truth. VFM is a vets organization that advocates for equal opportunity in the U.S. Armed Forces, that is race neutral, exclusively merit-based military officer accessions, assignments, and promotion policies. VFM is an apolitical, nonprofit veterans organization, and over 80% of our 627 members are combat experienced with 934 combat tours. Participants in every armed conflict in which the U.S. is engaged, from Korea to Afghanistan, as well as clandestine operations of various types. VFM members are both officer and enlisted from every military branch. They've served at every level on and off the battlefield, in the air and at sea, including every level of ground, sea, and air combat leadership. 476 total combat leader positions, from rifle team leader to corps commander. They've commanded carrier battle groups, submarine and surface force fleets, commanded supercarriers, nuclear submarines, destroyers, missile units, fighter and bomber squadrons, and Air Force wings, and commanded special operations organizations. The president of Veterans for Fairness and Merit, Scott McQuarrie, a West Point graduate, a former infantry officer, and an attorney, is my guest today to go in depth on this case. Scott, welcome to the Rob Maness Show.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. Let's dive right into it. Did I get the mission of VFM correct?
You got it precisely right. Our goal is to pursue equal opportunity, race neutral, exclusively merit-based decision-making in military officer accessions, assignments, and promotions. That's our mission.
Yeah, and Scott, you're an attorney, so you have written VFM's amicus brief to go before the Supreme Court, correct?
That's correct. We filed that brief on May 9th of this year as an amicus brief in support of Students for Fair Admissions. And we certainly hope that the court pays attention to our brief.
Yeah, so we mentioned some policies. I did, very generally in my monologue, but what specifically are these Department of Defense or service practices that we know about? What are they, and why are they so wrong for our country and for our military?
Well, that's a great question. And I should start by saying that DOD has done a pretty good job of concealing what those practices have been over the years. And unknown to almost everyone, for example, the service academies began using racial preferences in their admissions procedures back in the 1980s. This is not something that's new. It's been going on a long time. And the reason that they did so was there was a very studied determination made at DOD that they would change the racial demographics of the officer corps. And their target, and they haven't said this precisely, but their target is to get the racial makeup of the officer corps in all the services to come close to the racial makeup of the enlisted force. And so I call that racial demographic parity. That's the driving force behind what they want to do. And they started with the service academies. And I don't frankly have a lot of evidence about what they've done in ROTC, but I do have some evidence and some knowledge about what they've done in service academy admissions.
Yeah, you are you're an academy, a West Point graduate, of course, but you're also widely knowledgeable on the Air Force Academy, and you have information on the Naval Academy too. The practices that we're talking about, though, they went all the way back to the 1980s. What exactly are they up to?
Well, again, their objective is to change the racial makeup of the Corps of Cadets and those who graduate into and are commissioned into the services. Back in the early 80s, the percentage of African Americans in particular was very low.
Yeah.
And they wanted to get that number up, as obviously the percentage of African Americans in the enlisted ranks has been much higher, over 20%. The percentage for African Americans was well below 10% in the Corps Cadets. And so what they did was year by year, where they have discretion, and they don't always have discretion on which applicant is going to be admitted, but there are certain categories, one of which is called the additional appointee category, where the academy, and I'm talking now about West Point, where the academy can pick everyone or anyone off of what they call the national waiting list, anyone that they want, so long as they are deemed qualified, quote unquote, as determined by the admissions office. As you know, on the congressional side, there are congressional appointments, and congressmen can, if they want to, designate the order in which the candidates have to be admitted by West Point, assuming they meet all the qualifications. But not all appointments are made that way. And so what West Point did was they established what they called class composition goals. That is, they came up with a percentage of what the Corps of Cadets should be for a particular race. And they had other categories as well, but the one that's really driving the use of racial preferences is their so-called African American class composition goal. And that goal in recent years has been around 15%. What they've had to do in order to meet that goal, and of course they use the word goal because quotas are clearly unlawful according to Supreme Court law. So they use the word goal. And in a military culture where we are mission oriented, goals oftentimes become quotas in practice. In fact, there's a Newsweek article written by a Marine officer whom I have met on that very subject, talking about how goals became quotas. What the admissions office does is they've got all of these class composition goals, and where they have discretion, if they've got somebody who meets the minimum qualifications and that person fits into that category, we'll just use African American, they'll pick that person even though there are other candidates who have higher, what they call whole candidate scores, and who objectively, using all of the criteria on the application, have been scored higher. They've passed them over in order to pick someone with a lower score in order to be admitted. And I'm aware of instances where there were applicants who were very, very well qualified and had high scores, who did not get in. And they did not get in because of their skin color. That's one example. And by the way, I have good evidence that practice took place at the Air Force Academy and at the Naval Academy. back as far back as the 1980s. And if you look at the graph showing what the percentages were, the makeup of the classes at West Point, it's a gradual change. The makeup of the class, the percentage of whites in the class has dropped steadily.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a perfect curve, but it's close to perfect. And now the makeup of the class is in the 60% of whites is around 60%. So they've gone to the high 80s or over 90% in the early 80s down to 60, and it's been deliberate. Now let me be quick to say, our organization favors diversity of thought and all of those inclusive practices such as minority outreach and recruiting, which the Academy spent a lot of money on. We favor that. We think it's good to have a good demographic mix. But in the military particularly, where the measure of success on the battlefield is, number one, accomplishing the mission, and number two, saving as many lives as you can of your soldiers, having the best qualified leaders is essential. And so part of our concern is that when you start diluting meritocracy by substituting racial goals that uses race as one of the reasons why we're going to select this person, you necessarily dilute meritocracy, and you get lesser qualified people in.
Well, since this approach has been taken, are you aware of the impact on data such as dropout rates, failure rates
Yes, we are.
of the classes themselves, specifically at the service academies, and what's happened to them? Has anything happened to them? Have they improved, gotten worse, stayed the same?
Well, we have that data for West Point only. We don't have that data for any other service academy.
Okay.
But an enterprising West Point graduate actually submitted a Freedom of Information Act request and got a lot of data. And then he analyzed that data, and then he published his analyses of that data. Some of those data quite clearly show, first of all, that Asian Americans have the toughest time getting into West Point because they have to have, on average, a higher SAT score than even a white candidate does. And by the way, that's not unlike what happens at Harvard and UNC and other schools. And so, really, the Harvard case, by the way, is about discrimination against Asian Americans, not white Americans, Asian Americans.
That's right.
The UNC case is about discrimination against Asian Americans and white Americans. But to get back to your question, the data show at West Point over I think a 20-year period, if I recall correctly, that Asian Americans have the highest graduation rate, followed by white Americans, and then Hispanics come after that, and then African Americans at the bottom. And the reason for that is that data tracks the admissions data that we have for those same classes. So you can see that the African Americans had the lowest average SAT score, and we don't have SAT scores for every single candidate. But we have averages, and the African Americans get admitted to West Point with a much lower average SAT score than do Hispanics and whites and Asians. And then the graduation rates are in the reverse order. Asians have the highest graduation rate. African Americans have the lowest graduation rate. And notably, there are qualified candidates, Asians, whites, who have higher median SAT scores, for example, than there are African Americans who get in with lower scores. So, in other words, West Point is passing over better qualified using their own system for evaluating qualifications in favor of minorities to get more minorities in, again, to fulfill those class composition goals.
Unless you're an Asian minority.
Yes, if you're,
Right.
if I should say, if I should be sure to add that. Yes.
And let me just clarify, Scott, for all the haters out there. You know, if you have an African American student that has what I would say, not being an academy graduate, but what I would say would be a best qualified SAT score, their graduation and dropout rates and all that are going to be the same as any of the white people or Asian people or Native American people or Southwest Asian people, any other person of color or demographic. They're going to be the same if their entry scores were at the best qualified level. It's the folks that you're looking at that are dropping out and are having trouble graduating are folks that have been admitted under these racial preferences with lower scores. Is that correct?
Right. That is right, and that's not unique to West Point. I think it's true everywhere. And one of the factors that's at work that the academies have to struggle with is that the pool of all the schools, Ivy League schools, other great schools, they're all competing for these well-qualified minorities, except Asians. There's so many Asians that score so well that they've got a real problem. But when we're talking about African Americans, West Point, Annapolis, Air Force, they're working as hard as they can to compete for these well-qualified African Americans, and they do get some. Fortunately, they do, and I'm glad for that. But the problem is these racial composition, or this African American class composition goal is somewhat like the tail wagging the dog, and dictating admissions decisions. And then the data reflect the data that we were able to get through the Freedom of Information Act, and that we then analyze, shows that. And I should be quick to add, the data isn't so perfect that we have all of their scores and we can say this particular individual, that particular individual. What we're doing is using SAT scores that and median and average SAT scores, and it shows that these preferences have been used. And then we do have it's sort of a grade point average that West Point uses. I think it's called a QCPA, something like that.
Okay.
And at graduation, guess what category has the highest QCPA? It's the Asian Americans again. And then after that, the next category that has the next highest average grade point average are the whites. After that, Hispanics, and then after that, blacks. And so the data line up from admissions all the way to graduation. Notably, West Point doesn't publish this stuff.
Really?
Yes, they have what is called the Office of Institutional Research, OIR, at West Point, that you formerly in past years published some data about graduation. They didn't break it down by racial category. They did, though, break it down by gender, male and female. And then they used to publish also retention rates. How many graduates served in the military beyond their 5-year commitment, 10 years, 15, 20. I don't recall all the gates that they measured, but they used to publish all that. They don't publish that data anymore. And that should be troubling. I believe that the American people are entitled to know those kinds of things. And in fact, we do need to know who's staying in the Army and who's not staying in the Army beyond their initial commitment. And that data needs to be analyzed. And the skeptic in me says, well, if the data were that that certain categories of graduates were staying in longer and that data fit the narrative, maybe it would be being published, but it's not being published. which I think is unfortunate. The transparency there has gone the other direction in recent years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's we've talked about the data, but I mean, my gut instinct after listening to you, Scott, is that the individuals that are being impacted in the most negative way are the men and women that are being brought in under racial preference goals. That not the ones that are highly competitive, best qualified, and all that, but the folks that don't reach that level of competitiveness and best qualified nature that are brought in anyway, it seems like it would have the most negative impact on them, which
Yes,
isn't what these types of challenges are supposed to be about.
yeah. Well, if you're focusing on what's best for the individual, many argue, oh, well, we need to set these people up for success. And so we're going to send them to West Point. We're going to let them in, even though they've got marginal qualifications according to the bar that we are allowed to adjust behind closed doors. We let them in, and then they struggle. And many of them fail. At least the failure rate for African Americans is higher than the failure rate for Hispanics and whites and Asian Americans. So they struggle and they leave. Along the way, during that struggle, they're consuming a lot of resources, extra instruction and labs and that sort of thing, and they end up leaving. So instead of setting somebody up for success, they've been set up for failure. That parameter is something that has been studied in the civilian context, and I've read articles that discuss the fact that when kids are admitted to schools and they're being admitted to curriculums that exceeds their qualifications, they change their majors, they drop out at much higher rates. Whereas if they had gone to a smaller school, where it's less competitive to get in, they change their majors or drop out at much lower rates. And so I had a high school Latin teacher once who said, "There's a school for everyone," and I didn't appreciate it at the time, but there is a school. Kids should go to schools where they fit in well academically as well as otherwise, so that they can pursue the major that they want to pursue. And unfortunately, some of these kids are set up for a big disappointment. But my perspective on this is the academies should be admitting students on the basis of what candidates are best going to serve the Army's interests. As in the case of West Point, is this candidate going to make a good Army, or does he have the potential, or she have the potential to make a good Army officer? Not filling buckets by race or gender, for that matter. The best qualified candidate should get in, because the data. This also has been analyzed. The how well one does as a cadet over all of the subjects is a good measure of how they do in the Army. They're going to be anecdotally, they're going to be exceptions. They're going to be cadets who graduate at the bottom of their class who end up doing well in the Army, and that's fine. But the data have been analyzed, and they show that the better one does as a cadet or midshipman, they're going to do better in the service into which they're commissioned overall.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But this argument that VFM will be opposing the other I hate to say veterans organizations, but national security professionals briefing, which is always one because it's never been opposed, in saying that, well, it's critical to national security that these policies be put in place, even though they're technically unconstitutional. And I think the Supreme Court has even recognized that in previous cases. That argument, you're going to go way beyond just admissions to the service academies or the other commissioning avenues. like personnel policies, promotion policies, and those kind of things, because you have to lay that out, right, to show the court that they've been wrong, because really that's what we're saying is that amicus brief. I think I can't remember what the name of it is. You can help us out there, but I think the first one that did it, put it out there, was a guy named Joe Reeder, if I remember correctly. That brief has got to be challenged, and this is really the first challenge from a national security professional and military leader and combat leader and combat experienced enlisted and officer personnel group. So talk us through, what are they doing in promotion policies and assignment policies, and what are those impacts on the force itself as a person goes through from being a cadet to officer to a command level officer to a senior command level officer? What are the impacts of all of this preference policies? Because it seems to me that fairness and merit are the two things that Private Snuffy looks at when he or she is contemplating whether they're going to re-enlist, for instance.
Yeah, well, even more starkly, I would say, I think the war fighter on the battlefield, the average soldier would tell you that he or she is most interested in the qualifications of his leader or her leader rather than the skin color of that leader. That is to say, they want a leader, a platoon leader, for example, who is going to be best qualified to be sure they've been properly trained, properly equipped, that the mission that they're about to go outside the wire on has been correctly planned or as well planned as possible, that the execution of the mission is done competently, and then when ambiguous circumstances come up, if they're under fire, particularly, the qualifications of this leader are the best possible to get them through that situation, to accomplish the mission and then get back inside the wire safely. That is what I think soldiers want. And this notion that DoD has, that they've just got to achieve racial demographic parity, ignores the fact that soldiers, I think, don't care about that. Soldiers care about having the best qualified leader to lead them. And if the person's Hispanic, great. If the person's Black, great. If the best person available when choices are being made happens to be white, why not best qualified? And I will add to that. I think the average American parents, moms and dads out there who send their sons and daughters off to the military to fight for us and to defend our country assume and expect that DoD is going to do everything possible to ensure that their son or daughter is returned safely from their military experience. And quality matters. Quality of leadership matters. It can make a difference on the battlefield. In the brief, for example, we talk about LZ X-ray, where then Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore led his battalion into the Idrang Valley, and the enemy had superior terrain, superior logistics and supply lines. Moore's battalion was airlifted into a relatively small landing zone. But for Colonel Moore's leadership, I think that battalion would have been annihilated.
Probably.
But anybody who's read the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, knows that Colonel Moore was a superior leader. And he made the difference. He made the difference in lives lost and lives saved by his leadership skill. Another example, not so much in the military, but think about that U.S. Airlines plane that had to, had to land in the Hudson River. The captain of that airplane I believe was an Air Force Academy graduate.
He was. He was.
Okay, Captain Sullenberger.
Captain Sullenberger. Yep.
I'll bet you that if you were to ask all the passengers on that airplane, were they glad that their pilot was best qualified in the training that he had gone through, they would all say, "Oh yes, we're glad we had the best qualified pilot when things were not going well in the cockpit." And the same is true of, your heart surgeon, your brain surgeon. We want the best qualified people to get picked.
Yeah.
Now that, and that's in any competition. The concern is on the other side of this issue is that, well, we're not going to have enough minorities in these slots. Well, the answer is we are getting there. And in 2022, unlike perhaps 1970, in 2022, skin color is no longer a reliable indicator of whether someone has been privileged or whether someone has been disadvantaged. And so when we're talking about college admissions, and you look at a kid's record, there are plenty of black kids out there who are go to just as good of schools as white kids. And there are some white kids who might live in Appalachia or who come from dysfunctional families, single parent families, and who may not have had a life of privilege, even though their skin color happens to be white. And so using race to rely upon who you're going to pick to try to even things out just is not a reliable way to do it. It's not accurate in 2022, and I think the numbers will show that over time we're getting, even if we were just basing it on merit, the numbers would be better. In fact, the individual I told you about earlier did an analysis where if the class, particular classes at West Point, had been admitted just on the basis of merit alone, he came up with numbers. And the numbers for African Americans are certainly higher than the numbers of African Americans in my West Point class. So we're getting there.
Yeah.
But we can't. Again, I want to go back to this point. We're talking about a profession where the stakes are so high. The stakes are life and death and mission accomplishment in defending the country. We just cannot afford to shortchange the quality of leadership when we decide who's going to be an officer. And this applies not just to the Service Academy graduates, this applies equally as well to ROTC.
It does, yes.
Yeah. So
yeah,
obviously ROTC is the larger source of commissioning for officers, I believe, for all of the services. I know it is for the Army.
Yeah, I believe it is for all the services too. The question, I mean, this, what you said about the life and death, it's a life and death profession. Bottom line, whether you're the youngest leader on the battlefield or the most senior and oldest leader on the battlefield, it's a life and death profession. And our whole system in the military, I consider myself an expert in the Air Forces, but having talked to many officers and NCOs from the other services and talked about their systems, they're all designed to promote the best qualified leaders to so they bubble up to the top, and then we have selection systems to select men and women to command units that are very, very high standard systems. And it's all about the best qualified, so that when you get to be a battalion commander or a squadron commander or even a platoon leader, the best qualified individual that's going to be able to do the two things necessary: get the mission completed and bring as many soldiers, preferably all of them, sailors, airmen, Marines, or Coast Guardsmen, it doesn't matter what service you're talking about, home, so that they can be ready to do the mission again next time. Those are the two issues. And we only want the best to do that. Just like I only want the best qualified airline pilots when I'm a passenger on an airplane.
Right.
I mean, that profession is similar, but like that. But the military, every single job in the military, doesn't matter whether you're in charge of transportation or if you're in charge of the infantry, every single leader has got to be best qualified because of those two issues.
Right. And the
And how does
distinction,
DOD justify that?
well, the distinction is first that the the military is unique in that, as you just said, it's lives and the mission.
Mm.
In the corporate world, it's money. Success is
Yeah.
measured in terms of dollars. Well, if you want to sacrifice dollars a little bit to perhaps lower the quality of leadership a little bit, if that's what they want to do, that's okay, I suppose. But we're shortchanging soldiers who are putting their lives on the line out on the battlefield when we don't give them the best qualified leaders that we could. Now, I don't want to be interpreted as saying we're never doing that in the military. I think most of the time they are.
Yeah.
But I know that some of the time they're not. And that's some of the time is usually the result of having used racial preferences in the accession programs. Now, to answer your question about promotions and command selection, in recent years, DoD has gotten more brazen in what they do. They're a little more bold, I think, because they think they can get away with it. And that's partly a reflection of our society having been more accepting of the use of racial preferences, which used to be called affirmative action.
Right.
And now it's labeled DE&I. And unfortunately, I've got reliable evidence that at a battalion command selection board, and this is all in our brief, a brigadier general was told a candidate that if they didn't have enough selectees of a certain race, that they would have to take off some of the white people at the bottom of the list and take some who had lower scores and select them. That's shortchanging soldiers. There's no excuse for that. You asked, how does DoD justify it? Racial demographics is number one to DoD. They are determined to get those percentages up to higher levels, whatever they have to do. And behind closed doors, they will do it. I will tell you, in the last year and a half, I've spoken with countless career officers, retired, and many of them told me stories about, oh yeah, well, let me tell you about what happened to me or to my friend who didn't get selected for 06 because of minority quotas. And here's how we know that. I've got some fellow members of VFM, who have told me that happened to them, and they were able to give me information sufficient in detail to persuade me that they knew what they were talking about. Even worse, I was told by general officers, not one-star general officers, about situations where with some general officer selection boards, the board had closed, they had finished their work, they'd all gone home, and the list was changed for diversity purposes.
Wow.
And we're talking the general officer selection list. Here's another example that's in our brief. The chief of naval personnel, a 3-star, about a year ago or so, publicly said that the Navy had decided they were going to revert to an earlier policy regarding promotion board packets. That is, the services had at one point said, you know what, we're not going to have official photographs and personnel files anymore at promotion boards because the board sees the race and we might be enabling discrimination against minorities by their use of those photographs. So we took them out. We took the photographs out of personnel files. Well, this admiral, a 3-star, said what we found with our 1-star boards was that, to use his words, diversity went down when we took the photographs out. And so we're going to put the photographs back in because we can't have diversity going down. We've got to have diversity going up. And so they put the photographs back in. And he said that publicly. Now that's what I mean by my
brazen.
saying they're more brazen now.
Yeah, that is brazen. I mean, I've had my own personal experiences at competing for senior officer promotion and everything, and some things have left me scratching my head, but I don't have any details like what you're talking about that would prove anything. But aren't these illegal, Scott? I mean, you mentioned racial quotas because of the word quota is really against the law. Well, aren't these policies against the law?
They are. And this is a very important concept, I think, for people to understand. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of our Constitution says that everybody will be treated equally before the law, period. Now, the 14th Amendment pertains to states, and the wording is no state shall deny the equal protection of the law. That provision has been held by the Supreme Court to apply as well to the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which applies to federal action. So that the same body of case law that applies or derives from the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the court has held would apply, the same analysis would apply on the federal level through the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Additionally, in 1964, Congress passed what is called the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Title VI, in particular, Section 601, is very, very clear that under no one can discriminate against anyone in a federal program. That is a program where there's federal funds that supports that program. Well, that would include obviously the entire federal government.
Yeah.
And so there's just no question in my mind, in my legal opinion, that if a person is taken off a promotion selection list, for example, because of his or her race, and someone else is substituted on that list because of their race, that would be a clear violation of Section 601 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a federal statute. Now, and frankly, I think that's why DOD conceals all this stuff so well. Even West Point, for example, if you want to consider admission to West Point or the Air Force Academy or the Naval Academy as a benefit under a federal program, I think it would qualify under that statute.
Sure.
And if someone could show that I didn't get in, but my buddy over here who happens to be black and same school, I know his extracurricular activities, I know mine. My application had to be at least as strong as his, and my SAT scores 150 points higher, but he got in and I didn't. Well, that if it can be shown that race was the factor, then that would be a violation of Section 601 of the Civil Rights Act, and it would be a violation really of that 2003 Supreme Court case and the 2015 Fisher 2 case, where they did interpret the Equal Protection Clause. I mean, where the brief that you mentioned that this group of senior officers filed starting in 2003, where they made this contrived claim of using racial preferences is essential to national security. I think it would be worth for your listeners, if we have the time, for me to explain how that fits in.
Yes, please go ahead. And I'll just remind folks that under Scott's title is a website link. And that website link it provides you the ability to join Veterans for Fairness and Merit and to donate to them. So that's where you go. Just pause your video or take a snapshot of the screen and go to that website because we do want more members of this group, and we want to increase the amount of members that have, especially leadership and combat experience, in order to make sure the voice is out there. And it's not just officer, it's enlisted too. And we want all the voices to be heard about this.
Yeah,
Go
and
ahead,
since you mentioned that, Rob, just so your listeners know, there is no cost to be a member of VFM. There's no application fee. There are no dues, and we want every veteran, especially combat veterans, to join our ranks and just add their voice to the chorus that leadership quality matters, and it's really, really important to our soldiers that we have the best qualified leaders all of the time, not 90% of the time, all the time. Secondly, we don't expect members to donate to us, but if there are people out there, members or non-members, who are in a position to help us, unfortunately, we have a lot of bills. I work for free. I don't get paid anything and haven't gotten paid anything in the last year and a half for all the work I do. And it's almost a full-time job for me to run this organization. But we had to get a good law firm in DC to file this brief for us, a firm, by the way, that has good street credibility with the Supreme Court in DC. And I still owe them a little bit of money for their brief, and I've got other expenses that we need to cover. So if people can afford to help us financially, there will be a place on that bit.ly link where they can do that. So we were going to talk about how this fits in legally, and why does people ask, well, how do racial preferences at Harvard relate to the military? Mm-hmm. Here's how it relates. This issue of whether or not racial preferences are constitutional has been percolating a long time. It's been dealt with back in the 1980s, actually, in the Bakke decision. But it came to the court in 2003. And the court in 2003 looked at this brief that was filed by the other side, and the legal framework. And this is the part to understand. Whenever somebody is trying to use racial preferences or do anything that would violate a provision of the Constitution, the legal framework for the court in examining whether they should be allowed to do so includes asking the question, is there a, quote, compelling state or national interest, unquote, that is so important that we've got to some way find a way to allow them to do this, even though the Constitution says you can't do it. Well, in the case of racial classifications, what the court decided was, well, we'll see if there's a compelling state interest or national interest here. And lo and behold, this brief shows up, filed by this group, not our group, but another group of 3 and 4 stars, in which they say, well, we've got to get the racial composition of the officer corps higher. And not only do we need to do that and want to do that, it's essential to national security that we do that. In other words, the message that brief sent was, we can't defend the country unless you allow us for colleges that have ROTC, which is most colleges, I guess, and the service academies, to allow race to be considered in applications. Well, 5-4, Sandra Day O'Connor being the swing vote on the court at the time, 5-4, the court bought that. In fact, the majority opinion that Sandra Day O'Connor wrote quoted that brief as justification for their determining that they would suspend the Equal Protection Clause, the strict enforcement of the Equal Protection Clause for, they said, 25 years. That is, the opinion actually says we shouldn't have to do this 25 years from now. And this again is in 2003. So, and then the issue, this came back to the court in the Fisher versus University of Texas case in 2013 and in 2015. And the court 4-3, another one vote margin, said that the University of Texas could consider race in their admissions programs. So the key, the determinant is there proof of a compelling state interest that is so important that we take the extraordinary action, really, of suspending the Constitution? That was the ruling in 2003 and 2015. And in all three of those cases, this group, the composition of which changed from each time somewhat, this group filed their brief. I found out about that some years ago, and I told myself, the information they're giving to the court is just wrong. I can assure you our country can be defended by our military without having to suspend the Constitution in order to increase the racial demographics of the officer corps. Our soldiers and sailors and Marines are trained to react to and follow the orders of their leaders, regardless of their leader's skin color. And
that's right.
As so many combat veterans have told me, when the bullets are flying and the mortar rounds are landing, nobody's concerned about anybody's skin color.
Having been a commander in combat, I'm here to tell you, I don't give a damn what's between their legs. I don't give a damn what color their skin is. I don't give a damn who they sleep with. What I care about is whether they can hurt the enemy, get our mission done, and get our people back home after the mission's done. That's the only thing that matters. It really is.
So what our brief is going to do, really for the first time, from a large group of veterans, is as we've said, we're telling the court the country can be defended by our military without having to use racial preferences in officer accessions. And then we go on to say, and oh, by the way, here's what racial preferences in officer accessions has done at West Point. All of that's in the brief.
Yeah.
And so hopefully the court's going to realize that what they've based their 2003 and 2015 decisions on, in part, was wrongly predicated. It's just not true that it's essential to national security that we use racial preferences to get the racial demographic parity that the Pentagon claims is, to use their words, mission critical. Mission critical. It's a contrived argument, and the reason it's contrived the way it is because that's what the legal standard requires.
Two more quick questions, and then I'll let you go. One is, we're a couple of military guys with military backgrounds. Both of us have kids that are in the military. I think you've got some that are West Point graduates. But it's not just us that think that this is wrong, right? I mean, what do the American people think at large?
Great question. Pew Research, a very well-respected national polling firm, has kept abreast of this issue, and most recently, in March of this year, 2022, polled over 10,000 Americans, and they weighted their polling for all kinds of demographics, politically, race, ethnicity, so as to get a reliable sample. And this is extraordinary, they found that 74% of Americans agree that racial preferences ought not be used in college admissions. And 59% of Blacks agree that racial preferences ought not be used. 74%. Are there any political races that you know of that are going to be decided by a 74% winning margin? Not many.
You can't get 74% of the American people to agree on anything these days. But so that's impressive. That's impressive.
Yeah,
And what's also impressive is that so-called minority demographics are. I mean, that's one of the highest numbers I've seen assigned to a choice on some of those. So that's incredible.
and there's a reason for that, by the way. Racial preferences are demeaning to high performing minorities, and there are a lot of high performing minorities out there.
Yeah.
And they're demeaning in the sense that most people who are motivated and work hard and advance themselves have self-esteem that demands of them that they feel like whatever recognition they get, they earned.
Right.
And instead of it being bestowed upon them for some social justice cause. It's just a matter of self-esteem. It's not rocket science. And the other way, and so when someone doesn't know, did I earn that promotion or did I earn that command selection?
Mm-hmm.
Their self-esteem suffers, and it's not healthy for anybody. The other thing is when their peers are evaluating them in an affirmative action environment, the presumption that should accompany being selected and promoted is lost. Nobody knows, did this person get promoted, this high performing minority get promoted because of his or her skin color or because he or she deserved it? And that's unfair to the person who got selected. Their leadership burden could increase a little bit because they don't have the presumption of competence that should accompany having been selected. And I think there are a lot of Black Americans out there who understand that and they've lived it, and they don't like it.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you. When I was a young aircrew member, women were just coming into those cockpits that I was flying in, and I remember having discussions with them where they said, "Look, we're gonna for at the individual level." Almost every one of them told me, or I heard them tell other people, "Look, I'm working hard, and I'm going to outwork you." Because I don't ever want to be questioned about whether I got a promotion or a position based on my gender,
Right. Right.
And they did. 99% of them always outworked everybody, and they outperformed. My best two combat pilots, co-pilots in my last combat deployment were both women, and they were fantastic combat aviators. And well, when the fangs needed to come out, their fangs really came out, and they did a great job. And I'd fly with them against anything, anybody, anytime.
And I'm sure that they knew that they had accomplished something and that they should feel good about what they had accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that it wasn't given to them.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Scott, I just got one more quick question for you, and that is, when is the Supreme Court going to hear this case? And is there anything the citizens can do as far as making their opinions heard?
Well, the time has passed for filing amicus briefs, but if people want to write letters or write editorial boards of newspapers, I guess, and make their feelings heard, that might help. The case actually is now two cases. They're separated. Deconsolidated is the word, and they're going to both be heard on October 31st, Halloween.
Okay.
That's when oral arguments will occur, and then the cases will be decided sometime, I'm guessing, in the early 2023 timeframe, and very likely no later than June of 2023. It's just going to depend on how long it takes for each of the justices to figure out what their position is going to be in the result. And it's going to be a very, very closely watched case. As you probably know, the Supreme Court term begins October 1, right around the corner next week. And I think that it will be agreed that this case, these two cases, Harvard and UNC, that will be heard on October 31st, will be the biggest cases so far, and maybe in the entire term, in terms of their impact. And the impact could be very significant. If one must understand, when the 2003 Grutter case was decided, after that, racial preferences in our society took off, not just in college admissions, but in business and in government.
Yeah.
And so the court, and it dilutes merit everywhere, in my view, so that if the court says, you know what, the Constitution says what it says, and we got to return to the Constitution and follow the Constitution and as it has been interpreted for years. And there's no real reason, there's no national security imperative, certainly, to disregard the Constitution. If that's what the court says, that could have a significant impact on American society.
It sure will. It sure will. And I lied. One more question, but it's with your send off. And that is, if a veteran joins VFM, can their name be added to our amicus brief?
Their name cannot be added to the brief. That is, we've already filed the brief. However, we do have a mechanism of adding to our member list in a second Dropbox, the link for which is in our brief, so that if we get our membership up, say in the next 3 or 4 weeks, or even the next 2 months before the decision is announced, if we get our membership up, the court could construe that as, oh, well, you know, people have become aware of this, and they're starting to enroll, and now we see it's not 627, it's 900 or whatever. So yes, there is the potential to help the cause by just enrolling. It is free, doesn't cost a thing.
Okay, and one more time, the link to join and donate is down at the bottom of the screen under Scott's name and position under BFM there. And the folks can go to the brief. You can get to the brief on the Supreme Court site, can't you?
Yes, you can. Just Google Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and you go to the Supreme Court website and you can access the brief for free. It's very easy.
Okay. Well,
And
Scott,
it's also linked in what we have on our Bitly site. There's a link in there for it.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. And Scott, thank you for continuing to serve our country. This is an extremely important issue. It has ramifications, bottom line, about lives and mission completion.
It does.
This is that important, folks. We get out and support it, and we appreciate all of BFM's hard work on this issue.
Rob, thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, friends, that was President of Veterans for Fairness and Merit, Scott McQuarrie, West Point graduate, former infantry officer and attorney, who is also a dad, and just like I am. And we want our country to have the best of the best when it comes to national defense and anything really. But it's crucial that it's life and death and it's mission accomplishment, which means preventing our enemies from hurting our country or even destroying our country. That's how important this is. So until next week, I'm Rob Manus.